Good morning. This is my sermon from Sunday, October 6th, 2013. My text today is from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 17, verses 5 through 10. Listen now for the word of the Lord. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." The Lord replied, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you. Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing or from tending the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron and serve me while I eat and drink. Later you may eat and drink'? Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.'" Please bear with me while I talk about myself for a few minutes. I don't always. When I was in high school, I started thinking seriously about my faith for the first time in my life. Teenagers tend to do that, question the beliefs they've inherited from their families. My parents had dragged me to church every week when I was little until finally I decided that I wanted to go with them. It seemed like I had at least some faith, or understood faith somewhat, until I met friends my own age who seemed to have more faith, or heard TV preachers talking about how much faith you have to have in order to be saved. There's a reason I don't watch preachers on television very often. Then it was time for college, and several of my new classmates seemed to have no doubts at all about their faith. They really seemed to have everything figured out. It was intimidating being around people who seemed so secure in their faith when I still felt like I was exploring mine. Why couldn't I be like them? Eventually, I decided that whatever faith I had was a gift from God, and it was enough. And I lived with that for several years until I got to seminary, and once again, I was in the presence of classmates who seemed very certain of things that I wondered how in the world people got that way. It's occurred to me how amazing it is that the church is so infected with consumerism. If you think someone has more faith than you do, even if you suspect they might be full of it, you don't admire them, you envy them. The disciples seem to have felt that same envy in today's story. They'd been traveling with Jesus for some time and had no doubt noticed his unfailing trust in God the Father. No doubt they also had in mind the miracles that they'd witnessed, like, for example, feeding large crowds of people with a very small amount of food, or walking on water, not to mention the fact that they'd been admonished more than once for their lack of faith. Maybe they'd developed an inferiority complex by this time. At any rate, they come to Jesus with the same request that I've made, and that probably most of us would make if we were to see Jesus face to face. Increase our faith. A modern reader might expect Jesus to lay hands on them, as he often does when someone comes to them with a request, and work a miracle, miraculously making their faith increase and leaving them speaking in tongues or seeing visions. Or you might perhaps picture Jesus in a more modern fashion, laying out a self-help plan that, if the disciples had only followed it, would have made their faith grow exponentially along with a 30-day money-back guarantee and so on. Wouldn't we be much more comfortable with either of those responses from Jesus? The response that he gives his disciples sounds more like a rebuke, or maybe even a warning. Which one of us wouldn't rather have a self-help program than a warning? Jesus obviously has a different idea than the disciples or us about what faith is and how you get it. Jesus' description of the power of faith makes it sound too tempting for us not to want to keep asking him for more. Surely Jesus wants us to have faith, right? So why is there no indication that he has any intention of fulfilling the disciples' request? What he says to them is, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Interesting description of faith. But the question I have to ask myself is, are the disciples really asking for faith like Jesus' faith, or are they hoping for superpowers? The ability to make a tree uproot itself and replant itself in the ocean is something of a superpower, like what you might see in a movie. To them, at first blush, this power to make trees move might seem like an extension of Jesus' healings. But of course, the disciples may not have in mind just that they want to be able to heal or feed large groups of people, because they're often not very enthusiastic about that kind of thing. Jesus describes a power, though, like a superhero's. I saw Man of Steel this past summer, the new Superman movie. The premise is, of course, there's a race of human-like beings with incredible strength and speed and the ability to fly. And of course, they come to Earth, and one of them, Clark Kent, uses his powers to protect the world from the other people that come from Krypton, who use their roughly equivalent powers to try to tear the Earth apart for the benefit of their planet. I think the point that Jesus makes is we can't be given any significant amount of faith just for the asking, because it would be too dangerous. We can't be trusted with that power until we learn what faith is for. We have our own ideas of what faith should be able to do for us. We've seen faith healings on TV, and we assume that with enough faith, we should be able to have big theatrical events with healings, and everyone will applaud. Or else we think that faith should be able to give us the power to not be troubled by whatever happens to us. Once when I was working as a chaplain, I heard of someone that was in the hospital sick, and he was very concerned because he and his family were at odds. He was sick and seeking medical help, and the rest of the family said that if his faith was strong enough, he wouldn't need medical attention, he'd be able to heal himself. Or at least in America, we've gotten into the habit of thinking that faith in and of itself makes us bulletproof, as though God, if we don't have faith, doesn't have any interest at all in helping us. But if we do have faith, we can help ourselves. We expect to be able to be bulletproof. Jesus has a different conception of faith. He sees faith as the ability to trust and rely on God. and to put yourself in line with the work that God is trying to do. If we were given the kind of faith the disciples want, without experiencing brokenness and without understanding that we need in all things to rely on God, we might abuse that power. We tend to think of ourselves like General Zod from Man of Steel, gods who are free to run amok and do whatever they want. Look at Jesus' faith in comparison. He never asks for more power. He never asks God simply to give him more faith. He simply asks God to help him do the work that God has set for him. Jesus is something of a pattern for us in terms of faith. Jesus submits himself to God by being baptized and then being tempted. During the temptation, Jesus learns not just to ask for faith, not just to ask for what he wants, but to depend on God's protection and to do God's work, even if it hurts, even if it's difficult. Jesus understands that God and not our own abilities is the object of our faith. And so faith for Jesus is combined with reverence for God. In Gethsemane, Jesus prays to God, "Take this cup away from me, but yet your will and not mine be done." Faith is a gift from God that helps us to trust God and to seek God's will. And so it's not given to us fully all at once. We learn faith by serving God and learning how much we need our Creator. When I was growing up, I heard a sermon from another pastor about the difference between faith in God and faith in our own faith. We Americans tend to think, because we're self-reliant, our faith itself will enable us to do anything that we want. But faith in our own faith doesn't save. Only faith in God saves. And faith in God is given to us by God in small amounts as we begin our faith journey. And any further faith develops and grows as we learn to seek God and to do God's will. Faith is God's gift of the ability to trust in him and to seek him. We learn this trust by being broken down and still trusting God. Times when we feel weak, especially, make us question our faith, make us wonder if maybe we didn't have enough and that's why we're suffering. Because these are the times when we most realize that we need faith. We tend to wonder where God is and whether he's abandoned us. The Old Testament passage recommended for today by the Revised Common Lectionary is from the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is the prophet Isaiah's response to the Babylonian invasion and the exile from Judah. Jeremiah makes no bones about the fact that he mourns being driven from his homeland and the fact that he's struggling to understand why God allowed that to happen. How do we react when circumstances change like they did for Isaiah? We may think faith is no longer valid because we're not in control anymore. Our faith doesn't seem to have saved us. Fortunately, though, God still can. Jeremiah says, "The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, and therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Jeremiah felt broken down, but he realized in his brokenness that God would save. And so he called out to God, trusting that God would answer. It's a natural desire to want great faith, especially in a culture that encourages competition and self-reliance. People tend to feel like failures if they can't keep up with the ones who seem to have great faith. God, though, knows that faith isn't something that we use to show up others or to build ourselves up. Faith is the ability to continue to call out to God even when he seems absent, trusting that he'll respond and living as though he were going to, not because of the power of our faith, but because of God's own faithfulness. Amen.